Good morning or afternoon, modern U.S. history students. I apologize I'm not there today to kind of be with you, but I'm there in spirit. Trust me, I'd rather be there. Hopefully, I'll be back in class on Tuesday, but until then, you're stuck with a recording of me and a sub. So here goes nothing. Uh, so last week, when we finished up talking about imperialism, we talked about the three presidents of imperialism: uh, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. And we kind of looked at their different styles of imperialism. And today we're going to talk about the Panama Canal and the Spanish American War. So we're just going to look at what other areas that the United States got involved in imperialism. You should have your guide out, your notes guide, and we'll finish the last three or four things today. Top right is going to be Panama Canal, and the bottom left is going to be Spanish American War. So Panama Canal, undertaken by Theodore Roosevelt, but it was always something that we were looking at. We were always looking to try to shorten the route between the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. Last week, we talked about the Navy and how the Navy became a two-ocean Navy. Well, we weren't sure that if we were to go to war with either a European country or an Asian country, by the looks of this, you can see just how long it takes a ship, our navy, to go around the tip of South America and go over to the West Coast or East Coast, depending on where you're at. So we're talking about national security. So two reasons why the Panama Canal is important for the Americans. The reason why it's important for American imperialism. One, global shipping is much faster. We are now a part of a global market. We are selling our goods to many, many, many more countries. And so we need a quicker route and a shorter route between the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. And second thing is, obviously, in times of war, we need our Navy to move a lot quicker. And so it's a security idea, really. So the Panama Canal, how did it start? We looked at many different areas, but the Isthmus of Panama is the ideal location, primarily because it's the shortest route between major bodies of water. Um, at this point in time, it was a province of Colombia, and so Colombia owned Panama and owned what we wanted. Originally, France had wanted to do the same thing. France had nations, or France had colonies in South America as well as trade with Asia, and so they're looking at different ways to trade with Asia. And so they originally had this canal, and they actually purchased a 25-year concession to build a canal from the Colombians. And the goal of theirs was to build a sea level canal, basically take out all the land and make it a sea level canal so you could just drive ships right through it as if it were a natural part of the oceans. But because of yellow fever, which is a major problem in Panama, as well as mismanagement, they banned their efforts. Over 22,000 French people died and just abandoned it. They asked us to take it over. They knew we were looking for a route, and so they asked us to take it over. And so they offered us, or they offered to sell what they had already done for 100 million. We basically said no and passed the Spooner Act in 1902 to buy everything that they've done for 40 million. Basically includes 25 million for what they had already dug, all the work that they had already done, and then $15 million for the equipment that was already there and the surveys that were done and all of that. We knew we weren't going to build a sea level canal, but we still wanted their information. Most of their materials, most of their stuff was just, it wasn't working, and so we didn't really buy it for that. After we paid 40 million to the French, we were supposed to work out a treaty with Colombia. So Colombia, we bought what they had done, but we still need to work out a treaty with Colombia in order to go into their territory, go into their country, and build this canal. And they said no. They said absolutely not. We are not going to do this. They didn't want the Americans in. and they didn't want us to be part of this. So, as we were negotiating, we decided that we're going to stall. Or sorry, Colombia decides that they're going to stall negotiations to try to up the price. Well, this ticked us off. This was Theodore Roosevelt at the time. And so what he's going to do is he's going to use his presidency, use his power as the American president to stage a military coup. Basically, he is trying to get the Panamanians to revolt against the Colombians that are already there and take over the country. Basically start a revolution. That is what he is trying to get the Panamanians to do. And what he uses is something called gunboat diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy, we had a warship called the USS Nashville outside of the Colombian waters, outside of Colombia, outside of Panama, where Panama is right now. Basically just threatening, hey, if you want to try something, if you want to defend yourself and kill Panamanians, we're here to help. We didn't threaten them per se. We just showed our force, kind of like what I was talking about last week, where instead of pointing a gun at somebody, we just showed that we had a gun. It's called gunboat diplomacy. And they won. And so we promised the Panamanians that we would recognize an independent Panama, and they signed the Hay-Bonavia Treaty in 1904, February of 1904. It's conveniently known as the treaty that no Panamanian ever signed, because the Panamanians had a French general, and that's who we signed the treaty with. So, however, what it does is it gives us a 10-mile wide strip of land for $10 million paid to the Panamanians. Colombia was asking for $25 million, and they were actually stalling to get the price up much higher than that. And so we helped the Panamanians gain their independence, and as a result, we bought a 10-mile wide strip of land for $10 million to the Panamanians. So what's wrong with that? Well, we promised that we weren't going to get involved. We promised that we weren't going to get involved, and we promised that we weren't going to get involved with the sovereignty of that country and the freedom of that country, and we do. We provoke a revolution against Colombia, support the Panamanians, and in return, they give us the rights to build a canal. It's kind of a quid pro quo, and just not seen as right. Not seen as right. So much so that after Roosevelt dies, Congress signs a bill that gives $25 million to the Colombians as a result of what we did. So let's go to the Panama Canal. We started construction in 1904. Over 75,000 workers from many different countries were there. They basically lived in dorms. They lived in company towns. But originally, a lot of people died right away from yellow fever. And so we knew we had to eradicate yellow fever first. So we brought in some chemists. We brought in some scientists and tried to get rid of mosquitoes that carry yellow fever, carry malaria. We finished it in 1914, which is 6 months ahead of schedule and $23 million under budget, but it still cost $375 million, so a decent cost. Here is them eradicating the mosquitoes, which was a huge deal. We still had over 5,000, I think it was 5,600 people that died, mainly because of yellow fever and malaria, but also because of accidents. It was so loud and a lot of explosions and trains kind of going by. We decided instead of doing a sea level canal, which would have been from here all the way to here, we decided to do locks. And so as a ship comes in here, the water level raises and the water level lowers. It goes into this one. This water level lowers. This water level raises. This water level lowers, and they go in. And then the opposite on this side. So that's what we decided to do. It's a lock system. And here's the trains that went by. They kept moving very, very slowly. They kept moving, and the cranes basically just put dirt and put rock and blown material in these as they took it away. So reaction to the canal. Obviously, Roosevelt's opponents are not happy with how he does it. It left this heritage of ill will amongst Latin Americans towards the United States, and we just didn't want that. So later on, like I said, we'll recognize the illegal means that we used to acquire it and pay Colombians $25 million after Teddy dies. So we kind of saw that it went. Obviously, Roosevelt supporters, and this was the most of the country, we approved it because we thought it was beneficial for national security and our prosperity, and so it it was good. It was what we wanted, what we needed. As an imperialist nation, we knew we needed both of those things: one, improve shipping, and two, improve security. So this is all we cared about. So most people were on his side. It's just kind of shady how it happened. I'm sharing these notes with you. You can watch this video if you want. It just kind of gives you information about the Panama Canal. Moving on to the Spanish-American War. So with most imperialist countries, there was skirmishes, there was battles, there were wars, and this is the one battle that we had. Um, so at the time, so this was 1897, 1898, and at the time, the Civil War is seen as this glorious war, and when dads and uncles and grandparents were at the dinner table or they were talking to each other, they would talk about the glories of the Civil War. Now we don't see the Civil War today as glorious, but people that fought in wars saw it as a glorious thing to be a part of, and so. This generation hadn't had a war for over 30 years, which at that point in time is, especially Europeans, that's unheard of. And so I think some people were itching for a war almost. And so we get it. And people volunteer, whether they were poor, whether they were rich, whether they were well off, whether they were, doctors, lawyers, whether they were whatever. And so we get people involved. Now, how do we get involved? At this point in time, Cuba was a Spanish colony, and we have had a desire to annex Cuba for a long time. We have had multiple presidents attempt to buy Cuba. Originally, we wanted it as a slave colony before we had the Civil War. I think it was Franklin Pierce tried to purchase, Martin Van Buren and Franklin Pierce tried to purchase Cuba to be a slave colony. So we've had our eyes on it forever. Plus, we have a large investment in the sugar industry in Cuba in the 1890s. So we go from wanting it for slaves to now wanting it for monetary means and all that. So what are the four causes? The four causes, I suppose we should look at your packet or your notes guide. So on the top right, the Panama Canal, what did the United States do that resulted in the building and controlling of the Panama Canal? Well, we provoked this revolution against Colombia, and we supported the Panamanians, and in return, they gave us the canal. So that's what we're looking at there. The means in which we got it. We supported a revolution, basically. So that's the Panama Canal. Now we're looking at the four causes of the Spanish-American War. Then we're going to look at the effects of it here later. So first cause, we sympathize with there's a rebellion going on right now. As I said before, Spain owned Cuba. Spain controlled Cuba. And so there was a Cuban rebellion amongst the Cuban people against the Spanish people. And so we sympathize with that group. We just sympathize with everything that's going on. We had help, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. We had help as a result of yellow journalism. And that's a term, and that's an idea that we're going to look at. And how the media really plays a role in the Americans wanting war with Spain. The third thing that's going to lead to the Spanish-American War is a Delome letter. Again, I'll explain that. It kind of just amps up this idea of American patriotism, American nationalism, and wanting to defend ourselves, really. And then the last thing, the straw that breaks the camel's back, if you will, is the USS Maine explosion, and really who we blame and why we blame them. So we'll talk about these each individually. All right, first, Cuban Rebellion. In 1895, the Cuban people, under the leadership of Jose Marti, who wanted to free Cuba from Spanish rule. At this point in time, Spain has lost multiple of their colonies, multiple of their establishments, and they really don't have much left. They have Cuba, they have the Philippines, they have Guam, and then a few small areas in Africa. But other than that, I mean, the Spanish empire is tiny compared to what it used to be. And so they're holding on to every last thing they possibly can. So the Cuban people try to rebel, and the Spanish sent over Valeriano Weyler, who was known as the Butcher. His nickname was the Butcher, and he forced Cubans into camps of reconcentration. If that sounds a lot like what Hitler does, it is. It is basically what Hitler does, forcing them in camps of reconcentration in order to work for them in terrible conditions, being treated horribly. So, how do we know all this? How do we know what happened? Well, we have yellow journalism. Yellow press is sensational headlines and pictures that try to make you feel and make you think a certain thing. What I want you to do right now is I'm going to have the sub pause the video, and I want you guys take 2 minutes. Take 2 minutes, go on your Chromebooks, and go on a news website. Go on either CNN, go on Fox News, go on MSNBC, go on any of those, and I want you to see the headlines, and I want you to kind of talk to your neighbor about what are they trying to get you to believe, because that's what journalists do. That's what most news places do. We know that they have biases. We know that they have biases towards something or against something. And so I want you just to go on this and look at some examples of yellow press. So go ahead and pause the video right now and open your Chromebooks up and go on one of those websites. Okay, now that you've done that, I want you to think about how you feel after that. If you are, if you went to a website that you support, something that you support, it probably just enhanced your belief that at what they said. But if you went to a website where it was against what you believed, then it probably made you a little mad. It probably made you a little mad. It might have made you think. It might have made you question, and that's what their goal is to do. So understand, when you look at headlines and look at things on the screen right now, they're trying to get you to believe a certain thing. If you want to look at headlines that are pretty non-biased and very factual, go to AP News, Associated Press, Associated Press News. Go to Reuters, Reuters. Go to BBC. Those are some really good websites that give you kind of a less biased feel. Anyway, so what we'd had in America is we had this group of yellow journalists, as they were called, and their goal is to get Americans to sympathize with the Cuban rebellion. They're trying to build up public pressure and put public pressure on the government to get the government to try to go to war with Cuba, or war for Cuba against Spain. What it's called is jingoism. And I know it's kind of a weird word, but it's called jingoism. It's this aggressive nationalism. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get you to really, really amp up that jingoism there. William Randolph Hearst, who he was I think he was San Francisco Chronicle, or he was one of the two major newspaper owners. New York Journal. William Randolph Hearst was New York Journal. And Joseph Pulitzer, you probably heard of the Pulitzer Prize or Pulitzer Prize. It's named after him. He had the New York World. And so they competed against each other. They competed for headlines. They competed for what would be clicks now. If you look at what the news people are trying to do, they're trying to get clicks. And so that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make the public aware and put pressure on the government to go to war with Spain. Sometimes they were exaggerated. Sometimes they were false. Sometimes they obviously wanted to have you see what you could see. They didn't have all the information we have, which is a blessing and a curse. Obviously, a lot of the information we have today, quote unquote information, is false, but it is out there. So many of the readers of these newspapers tried to get Congress and the president to intervene in Cuba. Then we had the Delome letter, and the Delome letter was written by a Spanish ambassador to the United States, called Enrique Dupuy de Lome. And what he does is in his letter that he sends back to Spain, he criticizes the American president, who was William McKinley at the time, called him weak. He said he was only concerned with gaining the favor of the crowd and all that. So this is a foreign power calling our president weak and stupid, basically, called him a weak and stupid president. And we thought it was just like the worst insult ever. With the help of yellow journalism, who made sure that we felt terrible about it, and they printed this highly critical letter of the president against the president, and they just thought as an insult on us, an insult on the American people, an insult on our intelligence. And so again, it amps up this jingoism, it amps up this idea of extreme nationalism. So yellow journalism. So start with Cuban Rebellion. Then we have yellow journalists writing about it. Then we have the DeLome letter, and they're writing about the DeLome letter. And finally, what happens is the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor, which is in Havana, Cuba. The USS battleship Maine explodes in front of the harbor. It killed about 260 Americans, and we were absolutely convinced that Spain was behind everything. And so yellow journalists blame Spain for the explosion of the USS Maine and creates this rallying cry, remember the Maine. And so they have all these different yellow journalists or yellow stories. And here's some headlines that were out there. Destruction of the warship Maine was a work of an enemy, bloodthirsty Spaniards, and the warship Maine was split in two by an enemy's secret infernal machine. So who are they blaming here? Who are they blaming? Are they saying, oh, it might have been an accident? No, they're not. They're saying absolutely, unequivocally, it was the Spaniards. The problem is the true story, which was never told, is that it was just a fire that was started in a munitions chamber, and we basically, on accident, blew up our own ship. But it didn't really matter because the groundwork was laid, and as a result of the media influencing public opinion towards the war, we go to war with Spain. And so if we're looking at the influence of media, well, we started a war as a result of the media's influence. So yellow journalism, yellow press put on this war. So it's known as a little splendid war. It's very short. It only lasts a few months, and it's very quick. We basically kick some butt. But what you need to know, first of all, we have the Teller Amendment. When we first started the war, we declared war on April 20th, 1898. And we promised the Cuban people that our goal is not to gain Cuba as a colony or as a state or as a territory. We passed in the declaration of war, we had what's called the Teller Amendment that said that we have zero intention to take political control of Cuba. And we promise that if we win, we will give control of Cuba to the Cuban people after the war. So that was a promise that we made to the Cubans. So a couple facts. They had a lot more troops. Some of them were guards in the concentration camps. We had 70,000 troops, 385 killed in action. About 5,000 were killed because of disease. Yellow fever was the worst. Malaria was terrible. But what this really does for us is it marks our entry into world affairs. We establish ourselves as an adult. We're no longer a kid. We need to be treated as an adult. And what this does for Spain is it essentially ends the Spanish Empire for good. Two theaters. There are two main areas where the Spanish-American War was fought. First of all, in the Pacific, and actually the Philippines, we use our Pacific fleet and attack them there under the control of Teddy Roosevelt first, and then the Secretary of War. And the second part or second area is in Cuba. We fight in Cuba. So it's again known as a splendid little war, just for how tiny it was and how quick it was. But like I said before at the beginning, we have people of all races, all religions, all creeds, all social backgrounds, and all this. So John Hay referred to it as a splendid little war. We declared war on April 20th, 1898. We originally fight in the Philippines, which had been a Spanish colony since the 1500s. So we start there very early. So the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley was Theodore Roosevelt, and he had ordered this fleet of warships to the Philippines before the war even started. And then on May 1st, so 11 days after the war starts, we open up fire on the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. And our ships were modern. Remember, we had steel-hulled ships and all that. And we captured it by August 13th. So it was fairly short. And here's where we get the idea of the Roosevelt Rough Riders. So in Cuba, we have this group of soldiers, volunteers, mainly from Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. They gathered mainly because of the hot climate that was there, as well as they knew how to ride horses. And so we have this mounted cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders, probably the most famous fighting unit in the Spanish-American War, under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. He resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in May after we had basically defeated them and wanted to join this volunteer cavalry. So it's going to be this group that's really mixed. Honestly, it's mixed of Ivy League athletes, people that could ride horses because they played polo, cowboys who knew how to ride horses, Texas Rangers, Indians, Glee Club singers. I mean, it really included everybody. And the most famous is the Battle of San Juan Hill. It was this cavalry charge led by Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders that charged up San Juan Hill, this is an actual picture of San Juan Hill, and tried to capture this right here. They wanted to get the high grounds, and they do. And then on their way from there, they go to Santiago Bay. So here's San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. They go to Santiago Bay. El Caney was another one that kind of was fought at the same time. But then they all met at Santiago Bay. The Spanish had their ships at Santiago Bay. They had almost all of their ships at Santiago Bay. All of them were less of quality than ours, and we absolutely dominated. So July 3rd, 1898, we destroyed their entire Spanish fleet. This was the entire Atlantic fleet of the Spanish. And so we're done. We're done with them now. So the Spanish-American War is over, and for about the 85th time, we have a Treaty of Paris. And the Treaty of Paris did two things. First, so this is the bottom one. How is Cuba impacted? One, we guarantee Cuba's independence from Spain. So Spain recognizes Cuba's independence. We recognize Cuba's independence. Number two, the top one. What territories did we gain? We gained the Philippines, we gained Guam, we gained Puerto Rico as a result of this. And we purchased them for $20 million from the Spanish. Let's see my funny meme. So here's a couple of pros and cons of the Treaty of Paris. What we get, what we don't get. We didn't. So a lot of Americans really didn't like Philippines. The Philippines saw it as like, hey, you guys gave Cuba their freedom, but you're taking us over. It's actually going to lead to a war with the Philippines, the Philippine American War, which is going to last 4 years. So it's terrible. So they really don't like us controlling them, which shockingly they wouldn't like that. I shared this with you. I'm not going to watch it right now, but here's an animated history of the Spanish-American War. Just a quick little recap of the Spanish-American War. Puerto Rico, we basically said we're going to bring under military rule. We're going to protect them, and our goal is to return them to civil government. We thought it was strategically important for a base to make sure that we have access to Latin America and South America. We also have Cuba. We grant them their independence. However, we force them to use what's called the Platt Amendment. That their their new constitution, which guarantees their freedom, must have and must include the Platt Amendment in it. And the Platt Amendment said that there can be no treaties that limit your independence. We reserve the right to intervene if you do. You can't go into debt because that means that it basically limits your independence. And last, we get a naval base, and that is Guantanamo Bay. I'm sure you probably heard of Guantanamo Bay. It's been in the news always. But Guantanamo Bay, I actually had a student at one point in time whose dad worked and lived at Guantanamo Bay for, I think, 4 or 5 years. So it's actually American territory in Cuba. It's American territory in Cuba. And that's that. Excuse me. That is the Spanish-American War, and now we are done. I'd love for you to watch this. I'm going to actually take some time and play this, and so I want you to watch and pay attention while this is going on.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about a subject near and dear to my white male heart. Imperialism. So here at Crash Course, we occasionally try to point out that the U.S., much as we hate to admit it, is actually part of a larger world.
Mr. Green, you mean like Alaska?
No, me from the past. For reasons that you will understand after your trip there before your senior year of college, I do not acknowledge the existence of Canada's tail. No, I'm referring to all of the green parts of not America and the period in the 19th century when we thought maybe we could make all those green parts like America, but, you know, without rights and stuff. So the late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of expansion and colonization in Asia and Africa, mostly by European powers. As you'll know if you watched Crash Course World History, imperialism has a long, long history pretty much everywhere. So this round of empire building is sometimes called, rather confusingly, New Imperialism. Because the U.S. acquired territory beyond its continental boundaries in this period, it's relatively easy to fit American history into this world history paradigm. But there's also an argument that the United States has always been an empire. From very early on, the European settlers who became Americans were intent on pushing westward and conquering territory. The obvious victims of this expansion/imperialism were the Native Americans, but we can also include the Mexicans who lost their sovereignty after 1848. And if that doesn't sound like an empire to you, allow me to draw your attention to the Russian Empire. Russians were taking control of territory in Central Asia and Siberia and either absorbing or displacing the native people who lived there, which was the exact same thing that we were doing. The empires of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were different because they were colonial in their own special way. Like, Europeans and Americans would rule other places, but they wouldn't settle them and more or less completely displace the native people there. Well, except for you, Australia and New Zealand. American historians used to try to excuse America's acquisitions of a territorial empire as something of an embarrassing mistake, but that's misleading because one of the primary causes of the phenomenon of American imperialism was economics. We needed places to sell our amazing new products. And at the time, China actually had all of the customers because apparently it was opposite day. It's also not an accident that the U.S. began pursuing imperialism in earnest during the 1890s, as this was in many ways a decade of crisis in America. The influx of immigrants in the crowded cities added to anxiety and concern over America's future, and then, to cap it all off, in 1893, a panic caused by the failure of a British bank led the U.S. into a horrible economic depression. A Great Depression, but not the Great Depression. It did, however, feature 15,000 business failures and 17% unemployment. So take that, 2008. According to American diplomatic historian George Herring, imperialism was just what the doctor ordered to help America get out of its depression. Other historians, notably Kristen Hoganson, imply that America embarked on imperial adventures partly so that American men could prove to themselves how manly they were, you know, by joining the Navy and setting sail for distant waters. In 1890, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History and argued that to be a great power, like Great Britain, the U.S. needed to control the seas and dominate international commerce. Tied into this push to become a maritime power was the obsession with building a canal through Central America, and eventually the U.S. decided that it should be built in Panama because, you know, how else are we going to get malaria? In order to protect this canal, we would need a man, a plan, a canal, Panama. Sorry, I just wanted to get the palindrome in there somewhere. No, we would actually need much more than a man and a plan. We would need ships, and in order to have a functioning two-ocean navy, we would need colonies. Why? Because the steamships at the time were powered powered by coal, and in order to refuel, they needed coal depots. I mean, I suppose we could have, rented harbor space, but why rent when you can conquer? Also, nationalism and the accompanying pride in one's country was a worldwide phenomenon to which the U.S. was not immune. I mean, it's no accident that the 1890s saw Americans begin to recite the Pledge of Allegiance and celebrate Flag Day. And what better way to instill national pride than by flying the stars and stripes over Guam. So pre-Civil War attempts to expand beyond what we now know as the continental United States included our efforts to annex Canada, which were sadly unsuccessful, and also filibustering, which before it meant a senator talking until he or she had to stop to pee, was a thing where we tried to take over Central America to spread slavery. But the idea of taking Cuba persisted into the late 19th century because it is close and also beautiful. The Grant administration wanted to annex it and the Dominican Republic, but Congress demurred. But we did succeed in purchasing Canada's tail. You can see how I feel about that. To be fair, discovery of gold in the Yukon made Seward's icebox seem like less of a Seward's folly, and it did provide coaling stations in the Pacific. But we could have had rum and Caribbean beaches. Oh, Stan, all this talk about how much I hate Alaska has me overheated. I gotta take off my shirt. Oh, my life. So hard to take off a shirt dramatically. I'm angry. Anyway, coal stations in the Pacific were important because in 1854, we opened Japan to American trade by sending a flotilla of threatening black ships under Matthew Perry. No, Stan, not that Matthew Perry. You know better. By far, America's best piece of imperial business before 1898 was Hawaii. I like oil and gold as much as the next guy, but Hawaii has pineapples and also sugar, which were grown on American-owned plantations by Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and native workers. Treaties between the U.S. and Hawaiian governments exempted this sugar from tariffs, and America also had established a naval base at Pearl Harbor, which seemed like a really good idea. Then. We eventually annexed Hawaii in 1898, and this meant that it could eventually become a state, which it did in 1959, 2 years before Barack Obama was born in Kenya. And this leads us nicely to the high tide of American imperialism, the Spanish-American-Cuban-Filipino War. The war started out because native Cubans were revolting against Spain, which was holding on to Cuba for dear life as the remnant of a once great empire. The Cubans' fight for independence was brutal. 95,000 Cubans died from disease and malnutrition after Spanish General Valeriano Weiler herded Cubans into concentration camps. For this, Weiler was called Butcher in the American Yellow Press, which sold a lot of newspapers on the backs of stories about his atrocities. And at last we come to President William McKinley, who responded cautiously with a demand that Spain get out of Cuba or face war. Now, Spain knew that it couldn't win a war with the U.S., but as George Herring put it, they preferred the honor of war to the ignominy of surrender. Let that be a lesson to you. Always choose ignominy. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I'm either right or I get shocked. All right, let's see what we got today. With such a conflict waged for years in an island so near us and with which our people have such trade and business relations, when the lives and liberty of our own citizens are in constant danger and their property destroyed and themselves ruined, where our trading vessels are liable to seizure and are seized at our very doorstep by warships of a foreign nation, the expeditions of filibustering that we are powerless to prevent altogether, all these and others that I need not mention, with the resulting strained relations, are a constant menace to our peace and compel us to keep on a semi-war footing with a nation with which we are at peace. Thank you, Stan. This is obviously President William McKinley's war message to Congress. You can tell it's a war message because it includes the word peace more than the word war. By the way, it's commonly thought that President McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war. He didn't. He let Congress take the lead. That's the only time that's ever happened in all of American history, which would be more impressive if we had declared war more than 5 times. So the document shows us that, at least according to McKinley, we officially went to war for American peace of mind and to end economic uncertainty. It was not to gain territory, at least not in Cuba. How do we know? Because Congress also passed the Teller Amendment, which forswore any U.S. annexation of Cuba, perhaps because representatives of the U.S. sugar industry, like Colorado Senator Henry Teller, feared competition from sugar produced in an American Cuba. Or maybe not, but probably so. Also not the cause of the war was the sinking of the USS Maine. The battleship, which had been in Havana's harbor to protect American interests, sank after an explosion on February 15, 1898, killing 266 sailors. Now, most historians chalk up the sinking to an internal explosion and not to Spanish sabotage. But that didn't stop Americans from blaming the Spanish with their memorable meme, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Let's go to the thought bubble. The actual war was one of the most successful in U.S. history, especially if you measure success by brevity and relative paucity of deaths. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war, and in many ways it was. Fighting lasted about 4 months, and fewer than 400 Americans were killed in combat, although 5,000 died of, wait for it, disease. Stupid disease, always ruining everything. There weren't a ton of battles, but those that happened got an inordinate amount of press coverage, like the July attack on San Juan Hill at the Cuban city of Santiago, led by future President Theodore Roosevelt. While it was a successful battle, the real significance is that it furthered Roosevelt's career. He returned a hero, promptly became governor of New York, and by 1900 was McKinley's vice president, which was a good job to have because McKinley would eventually be assassinated. A more important battle was that of Manila Bay, in which Commodore George Dewey destroyed a tiny Spanish fleet and took the Philippines. This battle took place in May of 1898, well before the attack on Cuba, which strongly suggests that a war that was supposedly about supporting Cuban independence was really about something else. And what was that something else? Oh, right, a territorial empire. As a result of the war, the U.S. got a bunch of new territories, notably the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. We also used the war as an opportunity to annex Hawaii to protect our ships that would be steaming toward the Philippines. We didn't annex Cuba, but we didn't let it become completely independent either. The Platt Amendment in the Cuban Constitution authorized American military intervention whenever it saw fit and gave us a permanent lease for a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Cuba and Puerto Rico were gateways to Latin American markets. Puerto Rico was particularly useful as a naval station. Hawaii, Guam, and especially the Philippines opened up access to China. American presence in China was bolstered by our contribution of about 3,000 troops to the multinational force that helped put down the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. But in the Philippines, where Americans had initially been welcome, opinions soon changed after it became clear that Americans were there to stay and exercise control. Emiliano Aguinaldo, leader of the Filipino rebellion against Spain, quickly turned against the U.S. because his real goal was independence, and it appeared the U.S. would not provide it. The resulting Philippine War lasted 4 years, from 1899 to 1903, and 4,200 Americans were killed, as well as over 100,000 Filipinos. The Americans committed atrocities, including putting Filipinos in concentration camps, torturing prisoners, rape, and executing civilians. And much of this was racially motivated, and news of these atrocities helped to spur anti-imperialist sentiment at home, with Mark Twain being one of the most outspoken critics. Now, there was some investment in modernization in the Philippines, in railroads, schools, and public health, but the interests of the local people were usually subordinated to those of the wealthy. So American imperialism, in short, looked like most other imperialisms. So Constitution nerds will remember that the U.S. Constitution has no provision for colonies, only territory that will eventually be incorporated as states. Congress attempted to deal with this issue by passing the Foraker Act in 1900. This law declared that Puerto Rico would be an insular territory. Its inhabitants would be citizens of Puerto Rico, not the United States, and there would be no path to statehood. But this wasn't terribly constitutional. Congress did extend U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917. Now it's a commonwealth with its own government that has no voice in the U.S. Congress or presidential elections and no control over its own defense or environmental policy. The Philippines were treated similarly to Puerto Rico in a series of cases between 1901 and 1904, collectively called the Insular Cases. But Hawaii was treated differently because it had a sizable population of American settlers who happened to be white. Ergo, it became a traditional territory with a path to statehood because white people, and also pineapples. Now let's briefly talk about anti-imperialism. There were lots of people who objected to imperialism on racial grounds, arguing that it might lead to, like, diversity. But there were also non-racist anti-imperialists who argued that empire itself, with its political domination of conquered people, was incompatible with democracy, which, to be fair, it is. The Democratic Party, which had supported intervention in Cuba in 1900, opposed the Philippine War in its platform. Some progressives opposed imperialism too, because they believed that America should focus on its domestic problems. Yet those who supported imperialism were just as forceful. Among the most vocal was Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge, who argued that imperialism was benevolent and would bring a new day of freedom. But make no mistake, underneath it all, imperialism was all about trade. According to Beveridge, America's commerce must be with Asia. The Pacific is our ocean. Where shall we turn for consumers of our surplus? Geography answers the question. China is our natural customer. In the end, imperialism was really driven by economic necessity. In 1902, Brooks Adams predicted in his book, The New Empire, that the U.S. would soon, quote, outweigh any single empire, if not all empires combined. Within 20 years, America would be the world's leading economic power. We didn't have the most overseas territory, but ultimately, that didn't matter. Now, the reasons for imperialism, above all the quest for markets for American goods, would persist long after imperialism became recognized as antithetical hostile to freedom and democracy. And we would continue to struggle to reconcile our imperialistic urges with our ideals about democracy until now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko.
All right. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And we still have a quiz tomorrow. Good luck on the quiz.